the first week of this special series on raised bed gardening, we talked about how to decide the proper dimensions for creating a new raised bed in your garden. Last week, we talked about the different materials that we can use to build those beds and options for purchasing or repurposing. This week, we tackle one of the biggest questions in raised bed gardening. How do you fill it? It can be daunting staring at this gaping box, trying to figure out how you're going to fill 18 inches or even 36 inches of depth without going broke. So today on Just Grow Something, we're digging into the dirt, literally, on how to fill your new raised bed. We'll cover the different materials that you can use to get your garden bed off to its best start for your plant's sake, but also for your wallet's sake. And we'll talk about the materials that you don't want to use, even if it's just to fill space in the bottom of a very deep bed, and the alternatives. By the end, you will have a pretty good idea of where to start and where you'll end up, so your raised bed materials can settle in over the winter and become the beautiful loamy soil you'll want to plant into in the spring. Let's dig in.
Hey, I'm Karen, and what started as a small backyard garden 20 years ago turned into a lifelong passion for growing food. Now, as a market farmer and horticulturist, I want to help you do the same. On this podcast, I am your friend in the garden, teaching evidence-based techniques to help you grow your favorites and build confidence in your own garden space. So grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something.
So before we dig in, I have a little bit of a maintenance tip for you as we head into the fall, specifically for your tomatoes and your peppers and eggplants and some of the other veggies that may take longer than 30 days from the time they flower to the time you will get the finished fruit. So if you have something that is going to take longer than 30 days, then when you are about 4 to 6 weeks prior to your next or your first anticipated frost, which is what we're at right now, at least in my area, now would be the time that you want to start pruning and topping those plants. If we think about this in terms of the energy availability in the plant, if you have a flower that is going to take, say, 45 days to produce a fruit, and you are only 30 days ahead of when your first frost is supposed to hit, then obviously that fruit is not going to get to maturity before the plant dies off. So we want to conserve that energy. We don't want the plant putting any energy into those new blooms. And I know that this is painful because right now, if you have had any break in your summer heat at all, you're likely seeing a bunch of your plants suddenly putting on all of these blooms. I know my tomatoes and my peppers specifically right now are doing this. I have tons of brand new blooms all over the place. But our first usual frost date is around October 20th or so. That's only about 4 weeks away. I know that none of those flowers are going to get to maturity at this point. So my best bet, in order to give all of that energy, redirect all of that energy out of the plant into those existing fruits that already are on the plant and are working on getting to maturity, is by removing all those other blooms. You can do this really easily by just walking across the tops of your plant. So that's usually where you see is like this fresh green growth going on and all these new blooms. You can just kind of start lopping off the tops of them. And that is going to redirect that energy down into the existing fruits. You might have to do this several times because, what happens when you cut off the top of some of these plants, where it's going to try to send out these side shoots around where that topping happened, right? And then it's going to try to flower. So this might be something that you have to do a couple of times, but I have seen really good results with doing this, like I said, in like tomatoes and peppers and even eggplant, just to sort of let the plant utilize its energy in a way that is most beneficial to me as the gardener. We want it pushing that energy into creating more mature fruits that we'll be able to go ahead and harvest. You can do the same thing too if you still have like winter squashes or pumpkins that are flowering but very obviously are not going to get to maturity at this point. You can either just remove those blooms, or you can chop the vines if necessary. You can cut them off where that brand new growth is going and just allow them to continue to put their energy into the fruits that are closer to the root zone that, might have a chance to actually, finish before the end of the season. My only caveat to that is with those sort of more succulent types of vines, like winter squashes, where they're really thick, you might be opening up that plant to the possibility of some diseases if you have pathogens that can enter into the vine from the areas where those get cut off. So if you're only growing a few of these squash plants, my advice would be just to take the blooms off and allow them to finish growing out the rest of the squashes and pumpkins. But if you have a ton of them and it's just faster for you to go through and just sort of chop them all off, then, be my guest. But either way, we want to be pruning and topping anything that is going to take longer than 30 to 45 days to get from flowering to fruiting. And we want to do this about 4 to 6 weeks prior to our first anticipated fall frost. Okay, so I know what I normally use to fill up my new raised beds, and I know what I advise my clients to do and what I help them do in their own gardens. But to prepare for this episode, I really did kind of want to do a little bit of a deep dive into the different gardening forums and places where, these questions are being asked, just to see what questions were being asked about this topic so we could address them. Questions about soil recipes and cheap ways to fill beds absolutely dominated the discussions around this. Okay, so gardeners were often asking about what the ratio of topsoil to compost is and whether or not they should add sand to the mix and how to layer in the materials. So let's take a look at 3 University Extension Service recommendations and 3 gardening expert recommendations, and we'll kind of compare them and we'll see what each one of them says, and we'll figure out where to go from there, right? So UMN Extension recommends filling beds with roughly 2/3 to 1/2 topsoil and 1/2 to 1/3 plant-based compost. They also said to add sand if your native soil is very clay. They warn that too much compost can dry out very quickly and that potting soil alone also dries out very quickly. UMD Extension suggests mixing compost and purchased topsoil in a 1-to-2 or 1-to-1 ratio, so pretty close to what UMN recommended. They basically said the only difference was if you're talking about filling beds that are on hard surfaces, to do equal parts compost and a soilless mix, and then add about 20% topsoil. And then UVM Extension also suggests mixing topsoil with compost. Ratio is about 1-to-1 to maybe only about 20% compost, and then lightening up heavy soil with peat moss or coco coir. So those are our 3 University Extension, recommendations, fairly similar to each other. If you look at some of the online experts, we have Nicole Burke from Gardenary, and she encourages filling the beds completely with soil and compost. So using a weed barrier of some sort at the bottom, and then adding in, basically a 1-to-1 ratio of topsoil and compost. Also recommends adding fall leaves in 6-inch layers and then topping it with 8 to 10 inches of the soil. Liz Jaros from Epic Gardening also recommends layering cardboard at the bottom, filling the taller beds halfway with logs and branches and leaves. So this kind of forms a passive compost. And then just making sure that the top 12 inches contains a high quality soil. She was emphasizing that the compost layer basically comprises about 25% of that top layer. And then we have Mel's mix. If you don't know Mel, this is Mel Bartholomew. He was the originator of the square foot gardening method. And the mix that he has always recommended or had always recommended was 1/3 coarse vermiculite, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 blended organic compost. And what they mean by blended compost is basically using about 5 different compost sources and blending them all together. So getting, mushroom compost and worm castings and some forest products or whatever, and then blending those all together, and that being your compost source, okay? So that's 6 different versions of what we should be using and how we should be layering in our raised beds. Some of them are similar to each other, some of them are very different. Is it any wonder that gardeners are confused about what to use? And which of these is going to produce the best results, right? How do we know? So let's demystify this just a little bit by analyzing the common components in each of these suggestions. And then we'll modify those suggestions to account for like our budget and maybe available materials. So excluding Mel's mix, which is essentially a soilless mix, all of the other recommendations include topsoil. So that's obviously component number one. The reason we want topsoil is we don't just want a full container of nothing but compost. This is partly for texture and it's partly for the microbes. We've talked before about the need for microbes in our soil to help release the nutrients from our compost and move those nutrients into the plant roots. If you pile nothing but compost into your raised bed, you will eventually get soil, but it will take about a year for that compost to really break down to be a texture that plants like and to have nutrients readily available for what we're planting. And honestly, we don't want to wait that long, right? So the topsoil we add is going to inoculate the other components with the microorganisms that we need, and it's going to contribute to that texture that we want. Your first choice for topsoil would be to take something from your own yard. Yes, even if the texture isn't great, like the heavy clay that I have here, that topsoil is going to have your native good little buggies in it that can go to work right away. The compost and the other amendments will fix the texture problem for all but the worst of the soils, okay? Your second option is to purchase local topsoil, which you can often do from the same local places where you would buy your compost. And then, of course, the third option is just to buy bags of topsoil from the garden center. It does seem kind of weird to be buying dirt, but a gardener's got to do what a gardener's got to do, right? So the second common component in all of these recommendations is compost. Now, I think the Mel's mix is actually on track with this when suggesting a blend of different types of compost, but use what you have available to you, right? This is where we start to look at availability of materials and also affordability of the materials, right? If the only thing that you can get your hands on is a bagged compost from the garden center, then use that. If, however, you have access to that and some mushroom compost, then do a blend of both. If you also happen to have a neighbor who has rabbits, who is willing to share the pellets, or you live near a horse farm that has like piles of aged horse manure, then add that. Now, notice that I said aged manure. Well composted manure, that's even better. I would prefer that, but herbivore manure that has been aged for about 4 months, that's fine too. If you're going to be using this bed very soon after building it and not letting it sit for a minimum of 4 months, which hint, hint, this is why we're doing this in the fall and not in the spring, right? But if you're going to use it right away, then I really would recommend sticking with things like rabbit, goat, alpaca, or sheep manure. It's got a little bit less nitrogen content than like chicken manure or horse manure or cattle manure, unless it's really well composted. But if you're building it now and you're not planting until the spring, then any of those aged manures will be fine. I do not recommend fresh manure of any kind other than that rabbit manure that we mentioned. And I will leave a link in the show notes to the Focal Point Friday episode I did about that a couple of years ago that has all of the pertinent information as to why. But just understand that fresh manure is not a good thing to be adding to your raised beds unless it has been aged other than the rabbit manure, okay? So next up, we're going to talk about the places where these recommendations kind of stray from each other, and then what I do in my own garden when filling new raised beds. I am really turning into a raised garden bed girly for sure. You know, I'm a little bit of a data geek, and I have seen such a major difference in my yield per square foot of garden bed between my raised beds and my in-ground beds that I am just continuing to convert more and more space around my farm to raise planters. It's why I decided to do this whole series, and it's why I reached out to my favorite raised bed company, Planter Box Direct. Their beds are made in the US by a small local New York business using 100% US steel, and up to 30% of that steel is recycled, while all the steel used in the bed construction is 100% recyclable. So, in 20 or 30 years, if the bed starts to break down, then yeah, it can be recycled into something else, maybe even a new raised garden bed. Join the raised bed garden revolution by choosing from the wide range of options at planterboxdirect.com and use this month's special code JustGrow20. From now until October 15th, you will save 20% off of your order and get free shipping. Planterboxdirect.com with code JustGrow20. The link is in the show notes. Okay, so a few of these sources that I pulled recommended adding peat moss to the bed mix. Now, I love peat moss for its water absorption capacity and for like adding texture to the bed, but there are a lot of concerns around the sustainability of the product as a whole. So much so that it's now being banned from being sold in Europe, and I have generally stayed away from it unless it's a component in my potting soil and it's only being harvested from managed bogs in Canada. That's highly specific, right? So what are our alternatives? Coconut coir, worm castings, cocoa hulls, rice hulls, pine bark. These all have different ways that they help with the structure and water retention of the soils in the same way that like peat moss would. So if the topsoil that you're using seems very heavy, and the texture needs to be broken up a bit, more so than what the mixture of compost is going to do for it, and you don't have a good mix of composted materials to use, try adding one or more of those suggestions that I just made. If your topsoil contains a lot of clay, then you might consider adding some sand to the mix as well. Now, be forewarned, sand is going to really change how the soil drains, and too much can actually make it drain too much. So clay soil doesn't drain well, so adding soil will help with this. Just be sure that you have a bunch of other organic material mixed in there, like the different components and stuff that we talked about, along with things like worm castings or rice hulls or whatever. Otherwise, clay and sand alone will pretty much make concrete when you add water. So let's avoid this, okay? And if you don't have very heavy clay soils as your topsoil component, then there really is no need to add sand right away. In fact, too much sand means you likely won't hold on to nearly as much water or as many nutrients as many a gardener in South Florida can likely attest to. Now, you may have noticed that only 2 of our sources recommended any other natural materials like leaves or twigs for our raised beds. And I would venture to say that the reason for this is because the university sources like to give recommendations that are going to give you a fairly predictable outcome. So recommending a specific ratio of compost to topsoil as your main components makes sense. But you'll notice the gardening experts from the other 2 non-university sites are the ones recommending adding leaves and other materials. Likely because they know a lot of us gardeners are looking to fill raised beds as frugally as possible, and adding twigs and branches and leaves is a good way to fill the bed with some organic materials that may be readily available and free, and they're also going to eventually break down into those nutritive components while they're filling up some space at the same time at the bottom, right? I like this approach, and it's something that we do here when we're filling in our new raised beds, which I will talk about here in a minute. Now, the only one of these sources to recommend adding vermiculite is Mel's Mix. I think this is because this is specifically a mix that does not include topsoil. It's a soilless blend, and there needs to be something in the blend that helps with moisture retention and aeration and nutrient availability. So vermiculite doesn't contain nutrients itself, but the structure of the vermiculite traps and holds water and nutrients, and then it releases it back to the plant roots as it's needed. Plus, it's very lightweight, and so that helps to just hold airspace within the soil for the plant roots to infiltrate into. So I'm not opposed at all to using vermiculite if you need to lighten up the soil in your raised beds. As a matter of fact, I've actually advised garden clients with in-ground beds in specific situations to use vermiculite for all the reasons I mentioned and more. But if your goal is to do this as inexpensively as possible, you may not want to add another purchase to the list. So this is one of those components that I would say use if needed, or if you're specifically following the Mel's Mix formula. It's not my favorite because, I mean, the Mel's Mix itself, the vermiculite is fine, but the Mel's Mix itself is not my favorite because it is lacking that topsoil component, and I find that to be very important, but to each his own. So what do I do with my raised beds, and how do I help my clients build theirs? That's up next. So when building a new raised bed, I will usually start with a really good layer of cardboard at the bottom of the bed because it will help to choke out any of the weeds that might be trying to come up, any of the native grasses that might be there. And at the same time, it breaks down quickly enough for those good guys to get through, right? You could also do this with, like we talked about last week, burlap sacks or whatever. Even if your soil is absolute junk underneath and you would never be able to grow anything in it, it is still important for the microbes and the worms. Yes, there are likely worms in there, even if it's junky, to be able to get up and get through into the soil that is eventually going to be in your raised bed. So a good layer of cardboard is great. I used to recommend putting like a weed barrier down at the bottom. I don't recommend that anymore because I have seen how a lot of these weed barriers will break down over time. Most of them are made out of plastics of some sort. They tend to shred. That's also leaving microplastics in there. So it is something that I no longer recommend. A girl has a prerogative to change her mind, right? Okay, with more information, we can recommend different things. So it doesn't really matter whatever size bed you have. I always start with that cardboard and then I layer a base layer of whatever carbon sources are available. So for you, this might be things like twigs and sticks that are laying around in the yard, large rotting logs. If you're filling a very deep bed, so if you want one of those tall 36-inch beds so you don't have to bend over, that's a lot of soil to have to fill. So, old logs are really, really good for this. Cardboard, shredded newspaper, and any other like non-slick paper products, shredded leaves, straw. I've used chopped up like dried corn husks and the stalks that go with it, even the dried corn cobs. You can use, like if you're building these beds right now, you can use the dead dried plants from this year's garden to fill the space in the bottom, just so long as they don't have any like plant diseases or any kind of bug infestations, right? These things can all form the base layer of our garden beds. They're dry, they're fibrous, and most importantly, they take up space, okay? And as they break down in the bottom of that bed, they are going to provide the structure for the humus that will eventually develop. This is why I don't understand why none of the university extensions recommend this. And I don't know if it's because like the availability of these items is iffy. Not everybody has access to it. That might be, I don't know. But, this is very similar to the role that these fibrous materials play in a compost pile. So just about any brown material that you would put into a compost pile can go in the bottom of your raised bed as you fill it. So these materials are not only going to save us some money in terms of the cost of filling the bed, but they're also providing airspace for the other components to break down. And that's going to give room for the little microbes to move around and do their work. Plus, they're also going to help with some of that drainage too. What I don't want you to do is to follow the suggestions of people who say just to take plastic nursery pots and put them upside down in the bed to take space, especially when you're trying to fill those really deep beds. Please don't do this. like we just talked about with the weed fabric, that plastic is going to break down. It is going to leach. We don't know what the consequences of that are at this point, and there's just not enough research. So don't do this, please. If you really need to fill space at the bottom of a very large bed and you don't have, logs or large limbs or anything or something that's organic to fill the space, buy a straw bale. Take the straps off of it, set it down into the bed, take the straps off of it and kind of zhuzh it apart and, let it fall apart a little bit in the bottom of that bed and then start adding your other materials. Yes, it's carbon. It's going to break down eventually, but in a really deep bed, it's not going to steal all of the nitrogen from the plants because your plant roots are going to be in those top 6 inches for the most part, especially in the early part of the season. And if you're doing this in the fall to plant in the spring, that's less of a worry because it's going to have the entire winter to start to break down. So just don't use plastic, please. If you want something permanently taking up that space, then grab some large terracotta pots and turn those upside down to take up the space. But just don't use plastic, please, okay? Now, you want this first chunky layer, right? All these chunky bits to take up about all but the top 6 or 8 inches of the bed. So let's think about that for a second. We are recommending 18-inch deep beds. So you have about a foot's worth of space in those 18-inch beds, obviously more if you're doing a very deep 36-inch bed, to fill in with a bunch of chunky stuff, right? That might seem a little high at first as it's piled up, but that is okay. It is going to compress as you add the other components on top, and then it's going to compress even more as it begins to break down. So this next layer is where I will add any aged or composted manure. So the nitrogen from this layer is going to be able to move in both directions. So it's going to go down into that lower carbon layer beneath it to start to break that stuff down, but it can also move up into that next soil layer above. And this is what we want. We want to go in both directions. If you don't have any manure to add at this stage, that is okay. We're going to move forward with the soil components. And this is where a lot of gardeners end up getting tripped up, right? What you put into this layer is what your plants, in that first season are mainly going to rely on for their growing medium and for their nutrition. So the thing that we want to steer clear of when we're adding this soil component is using straight garden soil or black soil or topsoil that you buy in the bags at the garden center or have brought in by a truck or whatever, right? If you get one of those bags and you break it open, yes, it is very dark, but it is very, very dense. The structure of this soil is very dense. And likely, if you are digging this up out of your yard, it is also likely going to be very dense, unless you are pulling it from an existing garden bed, which would also be kind of a cool idea. But if you're purchasing these things, these soils are intended to be used like as an additive to an in-ground bed to improve their structure. So we only want to use this as just one component in the soil layer of our raised beds. It should not be used by itself. This also goes, by the way, if you're doing things in small containers, like if you're growing things in a pot, like on your back deck, you do not want to go out and just dig up your soil and throw it into that pot and then try to grow something in it. It will very quickly compact because there's, again, nothing holding that air space open. And so you're going to have just a clump of soil in that pot, which is going to continue to shrink down, and there won't be any space in there for those roots, right? Now, if you can find topsoil that is already being sold in combination with compost, now we're talking. Okay, this is getting us much closer to creating this sort of loose, well-draining soil that is also full of nutrients. This is exactly what we want. If you can find pulverized topsoil, which basically just means that it has been ground down to a texture that is nice and fine, not super chunky, that's even better. But anything labeled topsoil should be fine. Now you want to mix the soil. If you don't have it already pre-mixed, you can't buy it pre-mixed, then you want to get the topsoil or dig it up out of your yard, and then you want to mix it in equal parts with the compost, okay? Now we are getting close to that sort of texture and nutrient content that we want. And like I said, if you have decent topsoil from your own property that you can use it. It is going to contain some of those native microbes that are essential for getting the nutrients to the plants. So if you have an area like that you need to level off, I mean, especially if that's you're building a new raised bed area and you need to level that spot out, then use that soil, right? Mix it into the beds. Just make sure that you include that compost component with it. That is a key. So carbon layer, manure layer, topsoil and compost combo, or just the topsoil and then add your compost. Like we said, a mix of compost is preferable, but use whatever is convenient and within budget. Mix it into that topsoil layer, and the combination of those two should comprise the top 6 inches of your bed. Now, speaking of compost, if you have compost that you have been making at home, but it isn't quite finished yet, go ahead and use that, but use it as part of that lower layer of bulk, right? It's not going to heat the bed up so much while it's breaking down that it would be detrimental to your plants, and it's going to take up some of that space. Just keep the unfinished stuff in the lower portion of the bed, like where you would put the manure. So if you have manure, then go ahead and add your unfinished compost to that. If you don't have manure, then let your unfinished compost take that place. If you have finished compost from your own pile, then you want to be using that in the top 6 layers of the bed, okay? Hopefully it's making sense to you the way that we're layering this. Once all the components are in place, I highly recommend putting the bed to bed for the winter with a layer of mulch. I love straw mulch. Use whatever you have. But think of it in terms of like tucking the soil away for the winter to break down and prepare for spring. The mulch protects the soil. It helps insulate those microbes and retain the moisture that they need to be able to move around and do their jobs. And it also protects that soil from blowing off with any heavy winter winds. Then in the spring, just pull back the mulch, mix the top few inches up a little bit just to kind of check the texture. And you really should just be ready to start planting. Now, if you don't love the texture in the spring and you feel like it needs more time to really be ready, but you're ready to plant now, there is nothing wrong with adding a layer of regular potting soil to the top couple of inches to help keep this, move the spring planting along a little bit. This soil layer we're talking about should be the top 6 inches of your container. We want a good texture and a good nutrient content there. So the reason that I might use potting soil as one of those components is because it has that great texture if you're using the right potting soil. Be particular here, okay? But it also likely contains vermiculite. And of course, we already talked about how that's going to aid in the structure and the water retention. And it also has some nutrients that are usually added to it, and that's going to be immediately available to those plants. So even if you're waiting for that compost down there to become a little bit more active, you may just be able to use the potting soil on the top, and there's going to be some nutrients immediately available, right? You may not need to do this at all. You might uncover your bed in the spring, and it's beautiful and glorious, and you can start planting right away, and it's no big deal. But if you uncover the bed in the spring and it just doesn't seem ready, or maybe you waited too long to put the beds together and they haven't had enough time to sit like as long as they needed, and you need to start planting, potting soil is a really good way just to kind of jumpstart a bed that you're going to be using right away. So your raised bed layers, chunky brown carbon layer, followed by manure if available, and any unfinished compost if you have it, followed by a combination of topsoil and finished compost, and then top that with mulch. That's it. Refresh it at the end of the season with some fresh compost, put it to bed for the winter with a new layer of mulch, and you will have raised garden beds functioning for you for years to come. Look, if you found today's episode helpful, if I answered any questions for you, and you have a new gardener who is looking to build a raised bed or two for next year, send this episode to them, please, or even share it to your socials. I truly believe anybody can be a successful gardener with just a little bit of knowledge, and raised beds are a really productive way to do this. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.